Hello everybody and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today's webinar centres around construction product EPDs and how to implement the new EN15804 update. Here's a sneak preview.
The new standard also introduces 6 optional impact categories. One of the most significant changes is the requirement for how biogenic carbon is treated at end of life.
The new standard actually came in as we were in the process of updating, so we had to make a decision kind of mid-update as to whether we would adopt it or not.
These new standards also require us to do a more thorough data quality assessment. So basically, how reliable is the data that we're basing our life cycle assessment on?
Very pleasingly, we were able to demonstrate decreases across most indicators, and the one that most of our stakeholders are interested in, the all-important global warming potential.
I think, naturally people want to compare EPDs, compare products, but just to that effect, you actually need to be careful just to make sure that, you're comparing the right indicators so they're using the same standard and that sort of thing.
Because BlueScope is involved in a sector with a high carbon footprint, it was interesting listening to the guest speakers explain how this new update is helping make a positive impact. With that, let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to our webinar series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from the Experts in 30 minutes. My name is Emily Townsend from ThinkStep. I'm your host for the next half an hour. Today we focus on construction product EPDs and how to implement the new standard. It's great to have such a big audience today. Our guest speakers today are Pip Stone, Sustainability Manager at BlueScope, and Laura Guccione, Senior Sustainability Technical Advisor, also at BlueScope. So in my brief introduction, I'd just like to cover the why, the what, and the how. Starting with the why, the main reason for the update is to align EN15804 with the European Product Environmental Footprint Method, known as PEF. And that's because EN15804 is a European standard. So if it's a European standard, why does it matter to us? Well, most EPDs in Australasia are published under EPD Australasia, which is partnered with the International EPD system based in Europe. The International EPD system aligns with EN15804 for all building and construction product EPDs, and they've published product category rules, that's PCRs, for construction products that align with the new standard. The new PCR is available now, and it must be used for all EPDs published after the 31st of December this year. In terms of the what, there are tweaks throughout the standard. Today, we're going to focus on the 6 biggest areas. In terms of the system boundary, the main change is that all of the construction products and materials shall declare modules A1 to A3, modules C1 to C4, and module D. The old standard required modules A1 to A3 as a minimum, and the rest were optional. So this new requirement is to include the full end of life and the next product system. Of course, there is still the option to include the other optional modules that are currently grayed out from the installation and use phases, and some of those might be required depending on if you're using a sub-PCR or a CPCR. There's also an exemption. But it only applies to products that meet all of these requirements. So they must be physically integrated with other products during installation so that they cannot be physically separated from them at end of life. They must be no longer identifiable at end of life as a result of a physical or chemical transformation process. And they must not contain biogenic carbon, which obviously doesn't leave a lot when you put those 3 together. The main example that would come to mind would be cement, because of course it's combined with water and with aggregates and goes through a chemical reaction, and you can't get the cement itself back at the end of life. So it's one example that would be able to claim the exemption, but the idea is that the majority have to declare these end of life modules. The construction products PCR supports some of these new requirements of the new standard by providing a format to report on them. So that adds to the bottom of the modules table. It adds in the geographical representation per declared module, and also the ability to report on the proportion of the A1 to A3 or A1 to A5 results that come from specific data. So that's the data that's actually been collected for your product. And that's assessed based on a global warming potential indicator. And the other area is Where an EPD covers multiple products or sites, the variation in results between the products and sites must be reported on. And again, this is given as a format by the PCR and is assessed on the GWP indicator. The next thing then is the list of mandatory impact categories, which has expanded from the 7 that we know and love to 13 in the new standard. There aren't suddenly 6 entirely new impact categories to worry about, though. You can see global warming potential has been split out into separately report on the fossil and biogenic emissions, as well as those from land use and land use change, and then the total of all of those. Similarly, eutrophication is now split to look specifically at the impacts to freshwater, marine and terrestrial ecosystems. There's only one indicator, ozone depletion, which remains completely unchanged. All of the other indicators have different characterization methodology. That's the way that we calculate the results. And most of them have different units. That means that the results are not comparable to EN15804+A1. There's also a new indicator, water use, which uses the AWARE methodology to look at the deprivation caused by water use. So it's not the absolute measure of fresh water, which can still be found in the resource use indicators. The new standard also introduces 6 optional impact categories, several of which may be familiar if you've had EPDs reporting on the Green Star additional impact categories previously. While these are described as optional, they must be calculated and reported in the LCA report, and the option is whether to report them in the EPD. Although if you choose not to include them, you still need to include a statement that they are not included. So only optional so far. The optional indicators do also come with some disclaimers that the results should be used with care due to high uncertainties and the limited experience of using the indicators. And again, that needs to be included in the EPD if you publish them. Another new requirement then is the declaration of the biogenic carbon content in the product and in the packaging, both as kilograms of carbon. The declaration may be omitted if the biogenic material is less than 5% of the mass of each one. So that means if the biogenic material in the packaging is greater than 5% of the mass of the packaging, it has to be declared, even if it's only a tiny proportion of the total mass of the packaged product. So each one's assessed separately. The EN15804+A2 standard contains the same wording as the old standard around requiring a content declaration that as a minimum covers substances of very high concern where their content exceeds the allowable limits. It's also got a separate new requirement to always declare the mass of the packaging. And that's somewhat related to the biogenic carbon declaration we just talked about. The PCR provides a really useful format for content declarations. It includes the packaging, as you can see, as a separate line, and some additional requirements that allow you to clarify the content of post-consumer recycled material and of renewable material where that's relevant. One of the most significant changes is the requirement for how biogenic carbon is treated at end of life. Remember that any product that includes biogenic carbon must have the end-of-life modules reported, so this is a really important aspect. And the most important part of it is how it's treated if it's disposed of to landfill. So this new requirement essentially means that all biogenic carbon must be released during the end-of-life modules, even where we might normally model it in a landfill as not being entirely released. So it still has to be released. That means that there is no storage of carbon in landfill. And it also means that the biogenic carbon over the life cycle cannot be less than 0. It was a quick whiz through the what's. In terms of how, beyond reading the standard and the PCR and familiarizing yourself with them, how do you actually implement all of this? Well, our top tips are to use the new EPD templates, which are designed to help you create an EPD to the new requirements and have got things like all of the new characterization factors and units set up in it. We strongly recommend including the old EN15804+A1 impact categories in the EPD. That can be either as an annex or under additional indicators. The reason for that is to provide comparability back against maybe previous versions of your own EPD, or so that they can be compared against products that haven't moved over yet. And it also allows compatibility with other tools and systems. For instance, Green Star and the infrastructure sustainability rating tool Material Calculator, which uses the old indicators. And lastly, we suggest that you start early. Choose to work with the new standard now, like BlueScope did, and you'll be hearing all about that in a moment. And with that, I'll hand over to Pip and to Laura.
Thank you, Emily, and hello, everyone. My name is Pip Stone from BlueScope, Sustainability Manager. And as Emily said, Laura and I are going to take you through a very quick run through of why we decided to move early on the adoption of this standard and what it meant for our EPDs. So just to begin with, anyone who hasn't heard of BlueScope, we are a steel manufacturer. We're international, but Laura and I work for our Australian business. We produce about 3 million tonnes of crude steel per year in various different products. And these are some of the brands that you might be more familiar with if you haven't heard of BlueScope. In terms of our EPD journey, if you will, it began back in 2015. In fact, it began before 2015, long before Laura and I joined the organisation. I imagine they were more than 12 months in the making, probably more like, 18 to 2 years. But they were published in 2015, and we published 3 EPDs for hot rolled coil, welded beams and columns, and Exceller plate steel, our plate steel. And then in 2017, we added a new EPD to the ranks, and that was for colorbond steel. And then, as you're probably all aware, EPDs have a 5-year life maximum, and so they have to be updated within that 5-year period. And so last year, we began that process. In fact, we began it in 2019, and we republished those first 3 EPDs at the end of last year. The new standard actually came in as we were in the process of updating, so we had to make a decision kind of mid-update as to whether we would adopt it or not. And so this next slide kind of takes you through our thinking. Essentially, on the pros side, we knew we were going to have to do it at some point anyway. So it was a matter of, do we do it now or do we wait another 5 years? And in order to make that decision, we were thinking about, well, what about future EPDs? So we may publish these ones to the old standard, but if we want to publish any future EPDs, then they'll likely be done to the new standard, and then we'll have 2 sets of EPDs that look a bit different and might cause a bit of confusion in the market. So that was, that informed some of our decision making. And then, of course, we wanted to retain our status as being ahead of the curve rather than following. So that was another factor. In terms of the cons, well, time was the big one. As I said, we were already on our update journey, and we estimated it took us about an extra month. It may well have actually been longer than that when you factor in all the extra data that we needed to collate, and then the extra time that Emily and the ThinkStep team needed to invest. And then the comparability of results was also another factor. If we went out and published these new indicators, we would also need to publish the old indicators. And I'm not sure how many pages difference it is, but our EPDs are now pretty, they were already pretty substantial, and it's added another however many pages of tables at the back. But anyway, they were essentially the pros and the cons, and we took the view actually that the short-term pain would be worth the long-term gain.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to continue talking a little bit more about the specifics, the technical aspects of our EPD update, and give you some real-life examples on what this meant for EPDs. But just to give you a bit more of context, and I believe already Emily explained this a little bit, but this is the hierarchy of how standards and product category rules fit within an EPD. So in the base, you'll see we have the ISO 9001 and 14001, which is the quality and environmental standards, which are very common these days in, I guess, any type of industries. But above that sits the ISO 1440 and 1444 standards, which are actually the ones that give the rules for how to do a life cycle assessment. And is a life cycle assessment ultimately that underpins all the data and the analysis and how we come up with the results that we actually publish in our EPD. So those are very important standards to have. Next, we have the ISO 14025, which is the one that gives the rules for how EPD programs should be developed. And on top of that is actually the general program instructions. So once you decide to publish your EPD with a certain program, in our case, EPD Australasia, this program will also have its own general set of rules that you also need to follow. And once you already had looked at that, that's when we get to the EN15804 standard, which actually gives you the guidance on what should be included in your EPD document specifically. And on top of that, you also have even more specific instructions in your product category rules, which is basically additional requirements that will be specific in our case to building products. And the new PCR that we were looking at as well is the 2019-14 PCR. On top of that, as you can see, there's an additional level. So these are even more specific product category rules for specific products. So there are some products within, the construction materials that might have additional requirements, but in the case of steel, that's not available. So the maximum level of detail we go for is the one provided by PCR 2019-14. What is these standards actually meant for us and our EPDs? So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the changes. Emily already mentioned it actually requires us to use new indicators and assessment methods. So it was really important that we actually checked that those will be available within the LCA software that we use, and also that we could easily integrate them into a new EPDs, like potentially new layouts and that sort of thing. These new standards also require us to do a more thorough data quality assessment. So basically, how reliable is the data that we're basing our lifecycle assessment on? Next, we have the inclusion of 2 additional modules on our evaluation for the EPDs. So module C, in our case, we had already included some of this. So we had included 2 subsets of the module C. However, we needed to extend to include them all this time. This is the end of life stage. And on our previous EPD, we also had included module D, which is the reuse, recovery, and recycling. So that was not a difference for us. We also had to start looking at our packaging. And when we're looking within steel, packaging is just a very small, contribution to the overall impact of the product. But because it's a mandatory requirement from the standard, we had to look at it, and also the biogenic content within the packaging. And we did. Number 5 is additional geographic coverage. So the data that we have on manufacturing processes, they're representative for which region, and also where is our product going to be used. In this case, it's produced in Australia, and it's also aimed towards the Australian market. So the geographic coverage is basically Australia. Also, the product variability, in our case, we're looking at the specific products. There wasn't that much variation within the products, maybe just small things within the different grades of steel that you can find within a product. And the sites covered, which for us are only steel making site in Australia at Port Kembla Steelworks. So that was the only site we covered. And finally, the recycled content disclosure. So there were a few tweaks in what we needed to disclose and how. We had already disclosed the recycled content in our EPD, in the first EPD we published, but we just needed to align this with the new requirements of the standard. So how does this look in real life? So as you can see, this is the disclosure of all the modules that we have reported. This is a screenshot from our latest EPDs. And as you can see here, this is one of the changes. So we added the module C1 and C2. So that's the construction and demolition impacts, and also the transport of those materials to the waste processing facility. So that's new within our EPD. The geographical disclosure, so basically AU, like all of our production is happening in Australia. And we also expect the end of life and the recovery of this material for reuse and recycling to also happen in Australia. So that's been disclosed now. And finally, we also have the amount of specific data. So how much of the data corresponds and accurately reflects our manufacturing processes. That's over 90%. The variation within the products is less than 10%. And the variation within the sites is not relevant because, as I mentioned, we only produce steel at Port Kembla at the moment. And in our product composition, so there were some changes we had to do. I mentioned the recycled content, for example. And of course, we updated on time, what the recycled content is. It varies from year to year. And we also cannot really accurately estimate the recycled content for a specific product because steel making is a continuous process. And it's just very difficult to really pinpoint, which batch is going to end up where. And there might be slight differences. So we are capturing basically the average for all of our steel making. And we also updated the way we estimate what recycled is, which is effectively pre and post-consumer recycled content. We have excluded from this value everything that is coming from within our operation. So all the scraps that get recovered and put back again into the blast furnace within our operations, that's considered recovered content. So beyond this 17%, we also have an extra 6.8% that is recovered internally, but that cannot be disclosed as recycled officially, just based on the standard. So that was something that changed as well. And we also included the packaging information. So that was a new requirement for us. We have, some steel strap, plastic film that is added, cardboard, and timber for dunnage for transporting the coils. So the mass of all these packaging was included, and also how this mass relates to the total of the product mass. So as you can see, it's a very, very tiny percentage in terms of mass, but it's a requirement. So we included it in our EPDs. And as you can see here, this is the final outcome. So in the background, you can see our old EPDs. The first EPDs we developed kind of faded away. And now we have the brand new shiny EPDs that we produced this time, and just showcasing some really interesting case studies on how, these products have been used in different projects. So we published 3 EPDs, the hot rolled coil one, the Exceller plate steel one, welded beams and columns, and what's new within our EPDs. And basically that's what we have been discussing throughout this webinar. So we comply now with the latest standard, the 15804+A2. We have included that braided recycled content values and the packaging information. And additionally, because we want to be able to compare, or that our results are compared with other EPDs and with other materials, and we know that there's a lot of standards, and including green building standards that ask you to use life cycle data for your products, and they're aligning with the previous EPD standard, we decided to include those indicators as well, and also all the additional Green Star life cycle indicators. So that our users are not really impacted by this transition until more EPDs that are aligned with the new standard become available in the market. So now I'll hand it over back to Pip, who will talk a little bit more about what else is new within our EPDs.
So I think this is our last slide, and really just to say that we took the opportunity not only to update with the new standard, but also in recognition that things move along a lot in 5 years, and certainly the sustainability space has moved, as has the sustainability agenda at BlueScope. So we took the opportunity to really update a lot of the kind of upfront collateral. We use our EPDs as a communication tool, as a marketing document, as much as for the technical information in the tables at the back. And in particular for us, the questions that we are asked by stakeholders a lot in terms of the future of steel, the decarbonisation landscape, circular economy, those kind of themes are all dealt with within the EPD. We also took the opportunity to provide an extra layer of detail within the EPDs themselves. So in the older versions, we looked at the kind of average steel production at Port Kembla. And this time around, we split the steel up by steel grades with a view to giving interested stakeholders a more representative information, basically. So it's been the steel's been split by its carbon content as well as its alloy content. You need to know what you're looking for within the EPD because there are many tables with the various sets of information, but it does enable more specific results. And then because it was an update, we were also able to do a comparison of our results with the previous results. It was complicated by the fact that we did do the splitting up by grades, but we were able to compare the new average with the old average and make sure that all our claims stood. And very pleasingly, we were able to demonstrate decreases across most indicators, and the one that most of our stakeholders are interested in, the all-important global warming potential with GHG reductions of up to 8%. I think that leads us on to any questions.
Fabulous. Yeah, if I might read a couple out. So thank you both. And yes, now over to you all and your questions. BlueScope seems to consistently take leadership positions in the market as an early adopter in sustainability. How do you put forward the business case to do this?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and I would say it's actually a lot easier to do it now than it may have been perhaps in Nicole's day a long time ago. Certainly, it's something stakeholders are asking for. There's a pretty strong drive, but also it's very in line with BlueScope's approach. BlueScope tends to talk about its bond or our bond a lot publicly, and in that bond, certainly there's a commitment to transparency and doing the right thing is what comes through, and so it's very easy then to make the case for initiatives like EPDs, which are very, very aligned with what BlueScope is trying to do. But I'd say combined with the likes of Green Star and IS rating and customers asking the questions, it's not difficult to make that business case. In fact, I don't have to do a physical business case document these days. It's a quick conversation. This is a good thing to do. Let's do it. Okay, go ahead is pretty much how it goes.
Doi, I hope I pronounced that correctly. You asked about the A1 and A2 impacts being incomparable, and whether that's because of differences in units or differences in the underlying calculation mechanisms. It's both. So primarily it's the way that they're calculated, the characterization factors. The old EN15804+A2 used to align with the CML characterization methods, and we're now aligning with PEF. So it's that, but it does also bring with it a change in units. Okay, so from Steve Haynes, we have a question. Are there any other EPDs that you are preparing? Pip and Laura.
Very timely question. Yes, there are. We have a long list, in fact. What we're trying to do now is just prioritize the ones that we want to get out sooner rather than later. So we do have a long list, and watch this space is what I'd say. Bearing in mind, I'm sure everyone on this call is aware that EPDs can take a very long time to come about, but we're in the fortunate situation that we've got a lot of the data now. All of our products are produced from that base crude steel that we've got all the data for, so it should be smoother sailing going forward.
So if I might throw another one at you, from Roland, have you had much feedback from the market, both direct and indirect customers, in relation to your EPDs and how you would use them commercially, or how the customers would use them commercially, both?
You know what? We haven't had a lot of feedback, I must say, which is somewhat disappointing. My view is that they're very helpful to our customers. I guess because they're so publicly available, people take them and use them, and then we don't get much of that dialogue. We have to probably be a bit more proactive in finding out exactly how useful they are. Certainly, we know when someone needs an EPD that we don't have, which has helped inform our ongoing work.
I think in terms of how they tend to use EPDs, I think, naturally people want to compare EPDs, compare products, but just to that effect, you actually need to be careful just to make sure that, you're comparing the right indicators, so they're using the same standard and that sort of thing. But also very often, I think EPDs will be used to just represent our products within a larger LCA, for example, for a building, and just see, how the impacts from the product fit in the context of the overall building. So hopefully that's what our EPDs are being used for.
Hopefully. So from James O'Byrne, what do you see as possible future steps for BlueScope to drive further sustainability performance? And he's expanded on that with, do you see any fundamental changes in the prime movers of iron, plant and steel making in the next decade or so? I hope you know what
just
that means.
a little question to finish off with. No, very, very happy to answer that, and a great and very topical question. Obviously, you know, we're asked this question every other day, and you see the headlines about green steel in the papers, and yes, certainly we'll see some fundamental changes in the next decades, I'd say. It's, you know, there is a lot of activity in this space, and it's really, really encouraging, and we are obviously following it very, very closely. If James, if you've got a particular interest, I can happily send you more information on what BlueScope's doing exactly. But if you look at our latest ASX release, there's quite a bit of information in there in terms of how the landscape is evolving and what BlueScope's doing, including appointing a chief climate change officer, which is very, very exciting. So yes, so we will see a lot of change. I would say, you know, it's probably more of the incremental nature in the next 10 years with the breakthrough in the kind of medium to longer term for Australia. But at the moment, it's a little bit of a guessing game on the timelines.
We will wrap there, and I can see there's a couple of questions we haven't yet answered, so we will come back to you offline to answer anything that's outstanding. Thank you again to Pip and to Laura for sharing your insights with us. We do have a few more webinars planned for you, so check out our website and our social media, and if you have any specific topics that you'd like us to cover, please do let us know. We're looking forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.